Okay, we are going to read from this book called The Naked Bible by Mauro Biglino and Giorgio Cataneo, I believe is how you pronounce his name. This is what the cover looks like. I read a book by this guy about a year ago and uploaded it. It was called The Book That Will Forever Change Our Ideas About the Bible. And it really put it into perspective about how the English version of the Bible has been very, very edited, manipulated, and mistranslated. Now, Mauro Biglino, he translates Hebrew, he translates cuneiform, which are some of the oldest languages that the stories from the Bible were first written in before King James, who was a Freemason, by the way, edited the Bible to his liking. So you got a question. What was King James' agenda when he edited the English version of the Bible the way that he did? Keep in mind that, from what I understand, King James is a Freemason. So if you want to get the real meanings from the original stories, you got to go back to cuneiform and Hebrew. And this guy translates both of those languages. He's been doing it for decades. All right, let's get into it. And this is pretty recent, by the way. If you see right here, the copyright 2021. So this is a pretty recent book. This is my first time reading it. All right, here's the index. And I believe this is the first section right here. It says, "In the name of Michael, the commander-in-chief." And what if we were wrong? Good question. Wrong about what? About everything. Who we are, or where we come from. Oh well, what of it? We'll just turn our beliefs upside down, throw them away. We'll change our minds about almost everything. We'll overturn our view of the world, of humanity, of the human adventure on earth. Madness? Certainly not. It happens. It has happened before. It will happen again. Sooner or later, it must happen. Because what always wins, it seems, is human nature. Our irreducible curiosity. It always happens. It is just a matter of time. One day someone just comes along and tells you that it is not true, that the sun revolves around the earth, that exactly the opposite is true. We can imagine the faces of the bystanders, at which point the discoverer shows them a telescope and invites them to have a look for themselves. The first reaction is always the same: disbelief, harsh denial, mockery. Come on, how is it possible? Let's be serious. No one wants to fool around here, especially not about certain things. Galileo, after all, can remind us of Ulysses. The adventure of Homeric hero seems to be speaking directly to us to this day. Running into explored territories requires a willingness to let the known islands slip out of sight, to let go of conventionally acquired knowledge. And speaking of Homer, if for the sake of argument your name is Heinrich Schliemann, and perchance one day you find yourself in love with the Iliad, what could you possibly guess from that? The road is certainly all uphill from there. If you believe that simple literary pages, however venerated as masterpieces, could unveil chapters of real history, the path ahead of you will be impenetrable. They will call you crazy, naive, a visionary. You also have a serious handicap right from the start. You don't belong to the stellar cast of the scholars, the self-appointed, exclusive cenacle of the official holders of knowledge. That mocking smile, however, might suddenly be wiped off their faces once you stumble upon the actual ruins of Troy. Through clenched teeth, will the skeptical at the point admit the impossible? Will they concur with you that the ancient text told the exact truth, that it contained precise and geographically detailed information? Astonishing to be sure, or perhaps just obvious. At least according to your judgment, your logic, why on earth, you wondered, Should the ancients have resorted to complicated trickery? Why take refuge in obscure symbolism, accessible only to the very few, to hide the veil? God only knows what mysteries. At the time, those able to read and write were but a tiny minority. What would have been the point of playing hide and seek with words? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to take those famous writings literally? And why are the insiders, all of them, so obstinate in their discarding a priori the idea of an ancient text might simply say what the author intended to write, neither more nor less, without any great feats of imagination needed to interpret it? The whole matter becomes even more complicated if the object of our research is not a poem about the Trojan War, but the famous book of all time, or the most famous book of all time, the big one. By far the most popular text in the world, more than Mayo's thoughts, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings. But how many have read the whole thing? It is a strange book as well, a collection of variable geometry. You will find a different version in every country you visit. For some certain books that compose it are valid, while for others they are not. And yet the title of this collection does not change. It is always the same. What changes even quite a lot is its content. Who wrote all of the codices? And in what language? This is unknown. The only certainties are negative ones. We only do know that the version available today and present in in practically all households is not the original one, the very first one. Those pages have been continuously worked and reworked right through the Middle Ages. Changes, corrections, additions, and subtractions. At least 11 books are missing from the count, even though they are mentioned in other texts of the corpus. But the real record of that volume is likely to be a different one altogether. It is by no means the most commonly read book, but it is one of the most talked about and commented on. By whom? By many intermediaries, who often do not know the native version, the one penned in Middle Eastern language of its writers. Had they read it, would they also have discovered that it is not, in fact, the sun that revolves around the planet? These are questions that have accompanied the protagonist of this story for years. We are not talking about Ulysses, naturally, nor about Schliemann. He is an Italian who has just turned 70 and carries his age very well. His quote-unquote discoveries, however, are something he simply stumbled upon. For work, he turned words from one language to another, and he gradually realized that the classical translations were inaccurate. Winged angels, omniscient and omnipotent deities, traces of metaphysical thought, soul, spirit, immortality? Not at all. All absent words, non-existent concepts, and imaginative interpretations. The scholar pointed out these errors and listed them. In the end, they filled a whole box. And when he emptied the box, 14 books came out of it. It all happened in the space of just 10 years. He has become a publishing sensation, a veritable phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands of copies sold in Italy alone. And then, in just a few months, his brand new YouTube channel reached millions of views. A strange fate for a shy, reserved, somber man and a lover of the silences of his mountains. A man from the Piedmont in love with the Alps, passionate about nature, flowers, mushrooms, birds, insects, and suffering from a strange disease, an insatiable thirst for learning and research. He was already in love with the ancient language of Greek and Latin, while he was still in high school. Over the years, book after book, without end. Subatomic physics, the mysteries of the universe, Indian mythologies, archaeology, geophysics, genetics, the conquest of astrophysics, and illuminating achievements of anthropology. Only one certainty, an unshakable faith in doubt, the Socratic awareness of those who know perfectly well that they will never know enough. That is the reason for such never-ending studying. Beware, though, he does not sell truths. He limits himself, so to speak, to suggesting hypotheses. And one above all, what if it were all true, all that is recounted in that famous book? It's a rather fine mess, because if it were so, if what can be read in the original language of that most famous book in history, then the world would never be the same again. It would be missing one essential element, the most important one, God, or rather, his official address. Doesn't he live there? Is the divine not to be found in those pages? I have never encountered him amid those verses I studied. The translator has looked for him everywhere, but he just isn't there. There is no trace of him. Are you certain? Absolutely. But let's be clear here. A premise is needed. Does God exist? Who knows? The translator is very careful not to talk about it, but neither does he have the unshakable certainties of atheists. He has the utmost respect for believers and keeps himself far from any judgment. What he does know, however, is that the God celebrated by monotheisms does not, unfortunately, dwell at all among those ancient scrolls. He simply never passed by there, not even by accident. A colossal misunderstanding? Let's call it that. Does the translator realize the enormity of this assertion? He certainly does. And that is why we are here to talk about it. Let me clarify, I only pronounce myself on what I know. I tell what seems to me to be written verbatim in the Bible. That's all. That's all, he says. As if he didn't know that millions of people have literally have revolutionized their way of thinking over the last few years, and they have done so thanks to him, Mauro Biglino. From his windows in the Susa Valley not far from Turin, you can see the shining peaks that separate Italy from France, a border region of historical significance. Didn't Hannibal descend from those very mountain passes with his legendary elephants? What we know for certain is that 1,000 years later, Charlemagne passed through there to defeat the Lombards. The battle of the Chius echoes in the Adelchi, I think is how you pronounce that. It's either Adelchi or Adelchi, among the verses of Manzoni. It was the year 773. The Franks bypassed the Lombard defenses by descending from the woods surrounding the Pirceriano, the rocky spur of the Sacra di San Michele stands. A millenary gargantuan abbey, a masterpiece of Romanesque Gothic architecture. Not only that, it is also the central element of the so-called St. Michael's line, formed by 7 large shrines dedicated to Archangel Michael, stretching over the 4,000 kilometers that separate Mount Carmel in Israel from the islet of Skellig Michael off the coast of Ireland. Skellig Michael even made into the holy saga of Star Wars. The director Jeffrey Jacob Abrams chose it as the setting for the final scene of the film The Force Awakens. And we all know full well that science fiction movies are nothing less than anticipations of pre-science regarding notions that we will come to know later on. These are the thoughts that accompany Mauro Biglino very often. Every time he leaves the car and puts his boots on to climb alone the mule track that leads up to the very same Sacra of San Michele, a wild area populated by mountain goats. The strange thing, he says, is that the Sacra has become very crowded over the years. I have never seen as many visitors as I do now. Devout pilgrims, hikers, families. One can reach it comfortably by car or via the footpaths. Its 500 meters can be mastered even more daringly by the railway set along the face of the rocky cliff that dominates the Sacra. In the esplanade behind this 1,000-year-old abbey, managed with loving care by the Rosminian fathers, one frequently encounters young free climbers with their colorful harnesses. They enjoy the view while having a sip of something along the many cycle hikers who will make the ascent with their mountain bikes. An audience of common people that would have been unimaginable before the year 1000, when this imposing cult center was built, suspended over the void to guard the valley below. Tradition tells us that it was Archangel Michael himself who asked for it to be erected. He appeared in flesh and blood in front of Giovanni Vincenzo, the hermit who lived on the opposite side of the valley. Talking archangels. Is this story to be believed? Well, for starters, it's a fascinating one. Michael, quote-unquote, appears in 7 different places from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, always asking the same thing, that a devotional center be erected for him. Careful, though. He does not simply, quote-unquote, appear. If we are to believe the Bible, the angels made themselves seen. They arrived, perhaps on foot, and then they left. Really? Of course. Biglino has discussed this quite effectively in numerous books and conferences quoting biblical passages. There is no trace, ever, of incorporeal beings. Michael then would simply have made himself seen in a lot of places too, from the British Isles of Galilee via France, Italy, and Greece. In Cornwall, says the expert, the grandiose sanctuary of St. Michael's Mount looks like a twin site of the more famous, spectacular Mount St. Michael, where Michael would have been, quote-unquote, seen by Bishop Hubertus, the head of the Diocese of Avranches. The prelate, though, was not particularly inclined to listen to him, and on that occasion, Michael did a rather unpleasant thing, though at least leaving him alive. He pierced his skull with a finger. The bishop then finally decided to build him a sanctuary. These places are all very similar to each other, all erected along the Michael line, all in dominant position, and always with the double presence of both rock and water, all strategic places as well. St. Michael's Mount was strategic for maritime communications off the coast of Cornwall, and Mount St. Michael was decisive in disputes between the Duchess and Normandy and Brittany. Monastery fortresses of military importance raised at those specific points at the behest of a strange archangel, though not exactly an ethereal or impalpable one. It is the very narratives of the time that describe a kind of warrior, a duly three-dimensional, ultra-corporal being, and one prepared to give imperious orders. Nothing different, one might say, from the physiognomy of a powerful character, or of the powerful characters whom the Bible calls by the Elohim. So the Bible. What is the effect of trying to reread it with Mauro Biglino? It is as if our eyes are open for the first time, finally able to see something that we have all had under our noses forever. It is enough it is enough to just read the Bible as it is, and that's what we normally don't do. We limit ourselves to letting it be told to us by those who themselves had been told by someone else without ever having to read it carefully, certainly not in its original language. Incidentally, this has been happening continuously for over 2,000 years. It's called tradition. That is to say, notions that have traveled through time, crystallized in very specific forms. It can feel a bit like passing the same box down to the generations without ever opening it. What does it contain, though? Is it possible that we take many undocumented statements for granted, affirmations that possess a certain air of mystery and fairy tales? But should you open that box, you might discover that those daring interpretations, so evocative, don't actually withstand scrutiny. They just don't make any sense. And that is exactly what our biblical translator found himself. On the other hand, he says that very same box, handed down for over 2 millennia, still contains other stories, beautiful and fascinating ones. What do these stories tell? First of all, they tell a story of a small group of people and their bond with the Lord, their commander. Not a human one, but not divine either. And then, among those pages, if one wants, one can read, or at least to deduce, interesting details about our origin as a species. Are these reports reliable? Nobody can know that, but the story of Genesis is similar to a great many other origin stories. Just to be safe, Baglino declares that he adheres to a precise method. I simply pretend that the Bible tells the truth, and then I verify that this truth is coherent. And is it? Very often, yes, it absolutely is. Everything can be explained in the simplest of ways. It's just a matter of asking the right questions, and the Bible will always offer a reasonable answer that makes sense. Questions, that is key. Children, for instance, are the great specialists in this matter. They drive us crazy when they constantly ask us why. So, as an example, have you ever wondered why Archangel Michael is called Saint Michael? Normally, saints are just men like us. That is to say, mere mortals, not archangels. Could that fabulous sacra, the spectacular Monte del Purgatorio, framed by the Alps, be a special gateway to rereading the Bible alongside Baglino? In recent months, the translator has dedicated a series of in-depth studies to this almost domestic Michaelian sanctuary, the one most familiar to him, with special accompanying audio-visual elements, the sacra and its line, of course, a so-called ley line, a sort of terrestrial energy field. Skellig Michael in Cornwall, Mont St. Michael, and to the south of the sacra, the 3 Mediterranean sanctuaries, Monte Sant'Angelo, the island of Simi, and Monte Carmelo. Monte Sant'Angelo on Gargano is a testament to the cult of Michael in the Puglia region of Italy. Here too, Michael would have made himself seen by the bishop, who was initially a bit reticent about the idea of consecrating a sanctuary to him, one to be created in the natural grotto above the town. Then, following a battle that took place in 492 and won, thanks to the intervention of Michael, he was finally persuaded to set up that important place of worship for him. Furthermore, Morrow adds, San Michael al Monte would also have had something to do with the Lombards, just like the Sacra di San Michael in Piedmont. The Lombards tended to identify the characteristics of Michael with those of Odin, a soldier and protector of warriors. Further south, in the Aegean Sea, there is another large monastery dedicated to Michael. It is situated in a Dodecanese, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, or in the Dodecanese on Simi Island in the town of Panormitis. The cult arrived there from Turkey, from the Colossae area, hence the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, and it was established after the discovery of an image, an icon representing Michael, dressed in stupendous metal armor. Once again, the archangel is here represented as a warrior. On Simi, the cult of Michael was established in a previous temple dedicated to Apollo, just as the sanctuary of Mont St. Michael itself was erected on a cliff that the Celts had consecrated to their god Belenus, also identified with Apollo. It is perhaps no coincidence that some websites dedicated to the St. Michael line, especially American ones, call it the Apollo St. Michael axis. That is to say, the Apollo-Michael line. Odin, Apollo, and Belenus were all divinities. So, was this mysterious Michael one as well? His name literally means he who is like an L. Marbaglino seems to have accustomed his readers to the practice of the art of analogy, of lateral thinking. Finding transversal connections can at times be indispensable for coming up with scenarios capable of becoming credible hypotheses when no other possibilities exist, precisely for lack of clear references. Let's not forget that the Bible itself is a collection of books without any sources. We don't know who wrote those codices, which tradition then attributes to this or that author. A sensational example, the book of Isaiah, the prophet, the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, is believed to have written only the first part of the book, which is 39 chapters. The second part, added much later, was attributed to an author who, by mere convention, was called Deutero Isaiah. Almost 2 centuries later, this second Isaiah would have written chapters ranging from 40 to 55, but the text, which is total 66 chapters, would only be completed by Trito Isaiah, the third Isaiah, decades later. But despite all this, the volume was permitted to continue to be called the Book of Isaiah, as if it were the work of a single author, always the same one, the greatest of the Old Testament prophets. Another very famous prophet, Elijah, is also present in the geography that makes up the Michael line. He regularly frequented the one situated at its southern end, the promontory of Carmel, a dominant position on the Mediterranean. Marbaglino emphasizes how important that mountain has been since ancient times. It is mentioned in Egyptian texts of the 14th century BCE, was conquered by the pharaoh Tutmosis III, and later visited by Pythagoras. Ancient writers tell us that when Pythagoras visited Egypt to perform the initiations that would grant him access to particular knowledge, he arranged to be left on the shores of Galilee, then climbed up that very same promontory. What's more, archaeologists have found human remains at Carmel, bones that they attributed to the Homo sapiens species. Mind you, these have been dated over 175,000 years before Christ. Yeah, that's right, in alignment with the whole narrative and the dates of the Anunnaki history and the cuneiform tablets, because they said that those guys were showing up here about 450,000 years ago. This means that if they really do belong to the sapiens group, they would rewrite what we know today, or rather, what we think we know about human or about the origins of our species. The biblical scholar smiles. For me, This would not be a surprise, considering that the Bible says in terms of what they, the Elohim, did in terms of genetic experimentation to quote unquote make us. I say this, of course, still pretending that the Bible is telling the truth. Anyone familiar with his work knows exactly what he is referring to, namely the cloning that Genesis allegedly talks about to explain the appearance of the Adamites. This was a special community of particularly intelligent super sapiens able to understand the orders of the Elohim, the lords of the Gan Eden, later improperly renamed the Garden of Eden. Yes, you guessed it. We are now entering the territory that Mauro Buglino has been dealing with for many years now. These results may have surprised many readers, but not many exegetes, especially Jewish ones, who have confirmed his intuitions and the accuracy of his translations. What we get from all of this is a world overturned, but only seemingly so. We quickly come to realize that what is overturned is not the Bible, but its theological interpretation, often contrived and completely disconnected from the textuality of the codices. If we stay true to a literal approach to the text, even the geography of St. Michael line of the St. Michael line changes. The Carmel, Buglino explains, is biblically important as well. The name means garden, vineyard, or even garden of El. In fact, it means the same root, El, also present in Mikael, in Michael's name. That very hill was almost constant dwelling, or a constant dwelling place of prophet Elijah, a very notable character. Elijah was in close contact with the Elohim, who in the end, according to the Bible, took him away with them. It also happened to Enoch, the patriarch who went back and forth into space with the Elohim. Yeah, if you ever read the book of Enoch, it's all just about like extraterrestrials with spaceships taking him up and showing them all their weapons material and all their material that they use to build weapons. And it's been removed from the King James Bible because, I mean, in my opinion, King James, who was a Freemason, didn't want people to know that there were these people running around with spaceships that were taking people up and showing them all this advanced weapons technology. All right, let's continue. The same thing happened to Moses, according to the apocryphal text telling us about his assumption. Was Mount Carmel truly important? Did this Israel terminus of the Apollo St. Michael axis have such a special significance? This seems to be demonstrated as well by the presence of one of its most famous regular visitors, Elijah. Also with Moses, according to the gospel text, Elijah himself would have appeared in front of Jesus when, shortly before being arrested, the Christian Messiah experienced what we know as his transfiguration. The disciples saw him transfigured, glowing in the company of two other luminescent personages, Moses and Elijah. Technically two undead, both quote-unquote ascended with Elohim. Is everything clear? Not really. For those not familiar with the word or the world of Mauro Buglino, perhaps some clarification will be necessary. Who he really is, what he did, what he claims, what his theses are, what they are based on, and how he arrived at those conclusions, step by step. Mauro Buglino here provides us with all the explanations and clarifications we need after 14 analytical monographs on various controversial aspects of biblical exegesis. He feels the need for a summary. St. Michael's line, it can be collateral regarding the corpus of the discussion, but only up to a certain point. I was on CME recently, and there I was, granted the honor of visiting an ancient library on the nearby island of Patmos, where the text was written one that today seems to have been made or have made a comeback in the 12th chapter, that text, in fact, mentions Archangel Michael. What text are we talking about? You guessed it, the Apocalypse of John. Okay, so that was the end of that first little introduction. We're going to continue the next part in another upload. The next part is titled Apocalypse, the Misunderstanding of Revelation. This should be interesting. All right, guys, see you in the next upload.